All right, so welcome back to the Young Idealist series on classical German philosophy and post-Kantian thought. And we continue to trace out this rich and complex history of ideas. And for today's episode, we return to Japan and the Kyoto School to trace out the philosopher Tosaka Jun. And I am joined by a very special guest who is both a good friend of mine, colleague, and an exceptional scholar, Dr. Fernando Wirtz. Dr. Fernando Wirtz is an assistant professor at Kyoto University's Graduate School of Letters and Joint Degree Master of Arts program in Transcultural Studies. Fernando's research interests are Japanese philosophy, intercultural philosophy, German idealism, ethics, the Global South studies. Fernando also serves as a board member of the Society of Intercultural Philosophy. Dr. Wirtz has published widely on F.W.J. Schelling, Frederick Kreutzer, the Kyoto School, Miki Kiyoshi, Tosaka Jun, Nishida Kitaro, Kosaka Masaki. He's the author of, this is a fantastic text, Phänomenologie der Angst, Symbolik und Mythologie bei F.W.J. Schelling und F. Kreutzer, and Myth and Ideology, an essay on the philosophy of political action in Japan with Mimesis International. Dr. Wirtz is also a returning guest on The Young Idealist. His first appearance was for our episode on Miki Kiyoshi and the Kyoto School, and I'm very happy to have Fernando back for this series and to learn so much from his expertise. So thank you for coming back on The Young Idealist, Fernando.
Thank you for the super kind introduction and for having me again. I'm a very big fan of your channel. So yeah, for me it's also an honor to be here. Thank you.
The honor is all ours, actually. Um, you are such a fantastic scholar, and your publications are so broad, from German idealism again to Japanese thinkers. Really excited to have you here. So maybe we can start off with some introductory questions. So, who was Tosaka Jun, and why do you think his philosophy and political thought matter for today?
Yeah, thank you. Osaka was a Japanese philosopher, I will say especially active in the 1930s in Japan during a time somehow marked by fascism, war, also technological disruption. So somehow a period of time very similar to ours, right? That's one reason why it matters, right? And he was related, I will say, to this group of philosophers called the Kyoto School, or maybe we can use the word constellation of intellectuals, right? It was a very dynamic group of people. He was very critical of some of these philosophers, but also kind of related and in dialogue with them. So his philosophy helps us to understand this period, but also I think helps us to understand this phenomena that are happening again, right? Fascism, technology. So these are very important topics for Tosaka.
Could you give maybe a brief biographical overview of Tosaka Jun's life? I always say this, it doesn't have to be too like over
Right.
exhaustive, but maybe just highlight some of the main events.
Sure. Okay, so Tosaka was born in 1900, so that means he was born in the same year than other Kyoto School philosophers such as Nishitani Keiji, so he has the same age as Nishitani, Nakai Masakazu, and then Kosaka Masaki. He will be colleague with these people that will become also kind of important philosophers. The beginning of his relation to philosophy is very similar than other philosophers of the Kyoto School, like Miki Kiyoshi. So he's a very brilliant high school student, and eventually he moves to Kyoto to study at Kyoto Imperial University. The dominant current philosophical current of the time was neo-Kantianism. So he was very interested, he was very into neo-Kantianism, and he was very into philosophy of science. His first interest is, so to say, philosophy of science, philosophy of mathematics. And this is why he was also very close to professor at Kyoto University, Tanabe Hajime. So Nishida Kitaro and Tanabe Hajime were the two, so to say, big names or big professors at Kyoto Imperial University. His first texts are about the notion of space in Kant, philosophy of science, but then around the end of the 1920s, he starts to be more interested in Marxism, probably thanks to the influence of Miki Kiyoshi. Actually, Tosaka himself writes this, right? I was kind of I shifted to the left thanks to Miki. Miki was also in Germany. He comes back in 1925. He brings Marx on the one hand, and he brings Heidegger on the other, and he starts to promote this kind of strange combination or between Marx and Heidegger, but it's very popular at the time. And it seems that Tosaka was moved by this, and he starts also to be involved reading Marx, but also in Marxist atmosphere or materialist atmosphere of the time. And this, of course, also brings some problems because we are talking about 1930s in Japan. That means we are talking about police control, ideological control, and persecution of the left. So this will also sign his whole life. So Tosaka will, after 1930, when he has this first encounter with the police, all his life will be about trying to escape police control. Anyway, in 1932, maybe that's another important year. 1932 is the year Tosaka founds this group of intellectuals, the Materialism Research Group, Juibutsuron Kenkyukai. This is kind of a group independent from the Kyoto School, even if there was some contact because Miki also writes in their journal. They also have a journal titled Materialism Studies. And this group is also very active. They publish a series of books. They publish this journal. They have discussions. They have discussions about technology. And this is, I think, very important for us today, right? So already in the 1930s, technology is a big topic because of the war. Japan needs to develop heavy industry. But at the same time, Japan experiences technology as a kind of alien thing, a symptom of modernization and a symptom of occidentalization, if you want. So Japan is in the middle of this tension regarding technology, and the Marxist authors are particularly interested in the phenomenon of technology. So this is one thing that is important. And then during the 1930s, as I say, Tosaka, because he had problems with the police, he's unable to really work inside the academia. So he develops a kind of theory of this. What he calls theoretical journalism. So he becomes very interested in writing about everyday aspects of life, right? So his theory, he starts to write about, for example, he writes about films, he writes about fashion, he writes about clothes, he writes about education. So he shifts also a little bit the object of his studies and develops this kind of very bottom-up, everyday oriented philosophy. Actually, he talks a lot. One of his main concepts is the concept of everydayness. Nichijose. Anyway, he does all of this having the police always behind his back. And by the end of the 1930s, the pressure is very big. He's free on bail. He somehow manages to not go to jail for a while, but at the end he's finally arrested, and he spends the end of the war in prison, and he dies. The reason is somehow unclear. It might be that he died for the bad conditions in prison, but some people say maybe there was also some kind of intentional something intentional in the conditions in which he was maintained. He was very young, so he died in 1945.
Could you say, are Tosaka Jun's main philosophical and even political influences? And how do these influences affect his own work? So even like the concept of everydayness you were talking about.
First of all, as I said, so he was interested originally in neo-Kantianism, so that's Rickert, Heinrich Rickert, but also Tosaka, in fact, translates one short text by Bindenwald. And this is important because I will say that Tosaka's interest in epistemology will shift to what I like to call a political epistemology. We can talk about later, but basically Tosaka is interested in how knowledge is always penetrated by political relations, power relations. So I will say first neo-Kantianism, and related to this Tanabe. So Tanabe is a very important figure at Kyoto Imperial University and interested in philosophy of mathematics, also philosophy of science. And I think that through Tanabe, Tosaka develops also this interest. Through Miki, Tosaka gets to know Marx more intensively, let's say. In Tosaka's book from 1930, The Logic of Ideology, I would say this is the first important book by Tosaka. The Logic of Ideology. In the foreword, Tosaka says, Tosaka mentions two names. He mentions Tanabe's name and he mentions Miki. So these are the two big influences for Tosaka at this time. And then let's say Tosaka seems to be a very orthodox Marxist to a certain extent. And he refers to Marx, he refers to Lenin, he refers to what was considered to a certain extent the orthodoxy of Marxism. But he was very aware of other philosophies. He was very aware of German idealism, of course, Hegel. So yeah, I will say those are the main influences. Tosaka will kind of criticize Heidegger's concept of everydayness, right? Because for Tosaka, everydayness, he says, is the hierarchy of priorities that is revealed to us in our daily life through our working experience. So, and within the capitalist relations of labor. So, everydayness for Tosaka means how I experience the everydayness within the rhythm of capitalism, so to say. But sure, in a negative way, Heidegger is also present for sure.
We've already kind of talked about this, but maybe we can go a little deeper. What is Jun's relation to, let's say, Kyoto School members like Tanabe Hajime, and how did his thought change in order for him to be recognized as part of the left Kyoto School? Maybe this is Mickey's influence here.
Right. Right. Yeah, but it's an important point because on the one hand, Tosaka will be very critical of what he calls the Kyoto School. In fact, Tosaka is one of the first ones to use this expression, the Kyoto School, Kyoto Gakuha. Maybe not the first one, especially there was this other philosopher, Tsuchida Kyoson, who also used very similar expression in 1926. But anyway, Tosaka is one of the first ones to refer to Nishida and Tanabe as the Kyoto School. Tosaka writes about this when he's already very strongly situated in Marxism. And for Tosaka, the philosophy of the Kyoto School appears as a kind of idealism that doesn't have really a relation with reality, with material reality. He writes, for example, whether this logic of nothingness is a logic, right? So he's very skeptic about the terminology of the Kyoto School that appears very theological to him. And at the end, also, even if he kind of senses that the Kyoto School philosophers are not really, let's say, fascists, as many people sometimes tend to understand, right, about the relation between the Kyoto School philosophers and the wartime Japan. Tosaka understands that and knows that these authors are rather liberals, so to say, or committed to the values of liberalism. This will be precisely one of the main critiques of Tosaka, that liberalism at the end tends to be complice or tends to justify fascism, even if those philosophers will not recognize themselves as doing that. So Tosaka, and I think this is also very actual, right? So Tosaka recognizes that liberalism in a period of crisis and in a period of militarism and in a period of extreme violence, liberalism is actually working for fascism, is kind of supplementing fascism. He has essays against where he writes against Nishida. He has essays where he writes about against Tanabe. He will also criticize Miki at some point. He will also distance himself from Miki. In the case of Tanabe, maybe it's one of the most interesting points because, as I said, right, on the one hand, Tanabe was his professor, his main, or the figure, let's say, the master figure at Kyoto Imperial University. Tosaka clearly learns a lot from Tanabe. Tanabe was also not just a philosopher of science and mathematics, he was also a Hegelian, so Tosaka also learns about Hegel through Tanabe. Tanabe's critique to Nishida is that Nishida's absolute nothingness behaves as a kind of unmediated substance, right? That's what Nishida wants to avoid. The absolute nothingness is supposed to overcome the Western notion of a substance or a god, right? However, Tanabe says at the end, Nishida's concept of absolute nothingness behaves as a kind of fixed basho, right? The place, the field where all things are contained, so to say. But the nothingness itself, the absolute nothingness itself, is unmediated. This is Tanabe's critique to Nishida. And Tanabe says we should rather understand absolute nothingness as absolute mediation, as a process in which the nothingness negates itself and we are never able to reify that thing that we call the absolute nothingness. Tosaka's critique to Tanabe is that Tanabe's absolute mediation ends up being unmediated, precisely because for Tanabe there is no unmediated nature, right? That will be part of the idea. There always when we have nature, we have a consciousness, we have a subjectivity perceiving that nature or interacting with that nature. And Tosaka, because he's a materialist, he wants to have a nature that precedes the subject, a kind of absolute object, so to say. But this is just to mention how there is also a connection, right? So it's not just that there is no dialogue, and because sometimes when you read Tosaka, he's very critical of all these authors, and it might give you the impression that he's just calling them idealists. But really, he has texts where he really engages in their philosophy and he tries to respond to their philosophy, especially to Tanabe's philosophy, which he considers very valuable. And he tries to overcome this idea of nature using the idea of this dialectics of nature that you find in Engels, basically.
Just a follow-up question. I've noticed that Watsuji has been recognized as more of a conservative thinker in the Kyoto School, whereas thinkers like Miki and Jun are recognized as left Kyoto School. Is Can
Mm.
we maybe make a distinction between what is Kyoto School, right, and the left Kyoto School, and a second point, sorry, just a second, maybe a
Yeah.
follow-up question. In relation to what you just said, Tanabe has this concept of the witness, right? There's a lot of relational
Uh,
concepts to Buddhism and right, and you were talking about nothingness. How does Jun square his relation to Japanese philosophy and materialism without, I mean, I'm not saying that Japanese philosophy needs Buddhism, but it's there in Nishitani. It's semi there in Nishida, although he's much more related to, I would say, Wilhelm Wundt and maybe Bradley and some other people that are really into pure experience.
right.
So just those two follow-up questions. How does he kind of overcome this tradition into materialism? You just brought that up a second ago. And the differences between, let's say, Kyoto School proper and the left Kyoto
Mm.
School. Sorry, those are big questions.
No, yeah, but they are important ones. Right. So this expression, the left Kyoto School, is a taxonomy used by commentators to refer to people like Miki Kiyoshi, Tosaka Jun, and also maybe Nakai Masakatsu, who was also kind of friend with Miki and Tosaka, and also a student of Nishida and Tanabe. Probably Tosaka will not identify himself, right, as a left Kyoto school, but I think it's not completely um, meaningless to sometimes use this expression, right? As I said, the Kyoto school is should be understood rather as a constellation of philosophers, not a group, because they don't have a kind of core idea or like a set of ideas that they all share. Of course, they are influenced by Nishida and Tanabe, and they are influenced by Buddhism, as you said, and they are influenced by certain critique to Western philosophy. But it's also very dynamic, and yeah, some people talk about the left Kyoto school, also about the right wing Kyoto school with people like Kosaka Masaki and Koyama Iwao. Um, anyway, but as you said, using the term left Kyoto school sometimes it can be useful, and I think even if Tosaka is very, very critical of Nishida and Tanabe and even Miki, we can recognize some continuities. For example, this debate about mediation. In this debate, you can recognize the influence of Tanabe, and maybe in a negative sense, even if Tosaka does not agree with the notion of absolute nothingness or the notion of pure experience and so on, I think to a certain extent he shares epistemology in this kind of paradigmatic sense that these authors criticize, right? An epistemology that separates subject from object, that understands that the world is completely unrelated to the knowing subject. And this is something that Tosaka's epistemology will also criticize. So for Tosaka also, there is no object without the knowing subject. But this implies a different type of relation. This implies a practical and historical relation for Tosaka. Anyway, yeah, so I will say this expression is sometimes meaningful. But you should not marry with this expression, right? Because maybe that there is such a thing as the Kyoto School and they act as a group. And they sometimes fight each other, they sometimes help each other. It's very dynamic. And the second question was about religion, right? Yeah, Tosaka is really one of those authors who seems to be quite. It's not like he has no interest in religion, but he seems to be rather very critical, at least, of the structure of religion. It's not really that he criticizes one religion in particular, and he is also he knows about different traditions. He clearly knows about the Buddhist tradition, and he clearly also knows about the Christian tradition. At some point, he's also working on a project of a Catholic encyclopedia that he was asked to help with. I will say he's very skeptic of how religion, especially in a period of war, and militarism, how religion is used to mobilize nationalism, to mobilize this kind of what he calls the Japanese spirit, the idea of the Japanese spirit, how the Japanese spirit becomes very closely related to religious ideas. So for that reason, he seems rather skeptic of that.
Perhaps we could talk about Jun's relation to Marxism,
Mm.
and his own activism, and also if you can maybe highlight some of his main concepts or his main methods. This way, you wanted to talk about his political epistemology. Maybe we can discuss this as well.
Yeah, thank you. So certainly, if you compare Tosaka with people like Miki, right? Miki was also influenced by Marx, but as I said, Miki's Marxism is mediated by existentialism or by Heidegger's version of existentialism. So for Miki, what is in the way Miki understands Marxism is through the idea of this being in the world, what Miki calls the fundamental experience, being in the world as situatedness, historical situatedness, and concrete situatedness within a certain system of production. But Miki still uses this concept of experience, the fundamental experience, right? And that gives us some certain how the subject also experience certain the dimension of subjectivity is somehow highlighted in Miki. In Tosaka, subjectivity in the sense of individualism or in the sense of the individual subject plays a much more, a much less important role. In fact, that's one of the critique points of Tosaka regarding the Kyoto School. For Tosaka, all this philosophy is too subjectivistic, right? What matters for Tosaka is not the individual, is the collective. The importance of concrete reality is maybe one of the main signs of, or one of the main marks of Marxism within Tosaka's thought. And yes, this is related to his way to understand political epistemology. So Tosaka is interested in the way we know the world. And he's interested also for that reason in the concept of truth and falsehood. So and that's also the scientificist aspect of Tosaka. So for Tosaka, there is objective knowledge, but objective knowledge is not just there for us to grasp immediately. So we grasp to the way we can access objective reality, so to say, is always through praxis. This is why his epistemology is a political epistemology, because our relation to the world is always mediated by politics. It's mediated by our position within society, or what Tosaka calls the class character of knowledge. So this is, I think, also related to idea of consciousness in Lukács, and what is sometimes called standpoint theory, which is not really a concept of Lukács, but many people relate this concept to Lukács. So standpoint theory is the idea that, or standpoint epistemology is the idea that the way you know the world depends on on the position you occupy within society in this case, or more concretely, depends on your class. So the idea in Lukács, this is translated as the idea that the proletariat has a better understanding of how capitalism works, so to say, because they experience capitalist oppression. And in Tosaka, we find the same idea. Tosaka also knows Lukács, so he quotes Lukács in some texts. But what is interesting for me is that Tosaka translates this into other fields, and here we find again the problem, this concept of journalism, or popular science. So for Tosaka, the masses produce knowledge. This is why also this is a political epistemology. Knowledge is produced through political action or through political relations or through power relations, but that means that also we can have a bottom-up production of knowledge. That means concretely what Tosaka says is the masses should organize themselves and produce their own knowledge, their own science, and their own journalism, because journalism is not just talking about what happens daily. Journalism is about engaging with what happens in the everydayness, in this dimension of concrete everyday relations with the system. So yeah, Tosaka takes these elements from Marx and reads them from this everyday perspective, so to say. And then we have the concept of ideology that is somehow related to this, right? important concept for Marx. Miki translates the German ideology into Japanese in 1932, if I remember correctly. Tosaka writes a series of books about the concept of ideology. 1930, this book that I mentioned already, The Logic of Ideology. Then 1932, another book titled something like Introduction to Ideology or Outline of Ideology. And then finally, 1935, The Japanese Ideology. This is the book recently translated by Robert Stolz into English. That's the first book that we have in translation. So yeah, the concept of ideology is very important for Tosaka, and maybe let me mention this. For Tosaka, and I mentioned already the question of falsehood and truth. For Tosaka and for Marxist tradition, there is one of the meanings of ideology is the idea of false consciousness, right? It's when proletariat or some social subject who does not grasp, right, the structure of reality correctly. Tosaka's definition is very similar, but he adds one element, which is time or temporality. So for Tosaka, or false consciousness is usually an anachronism. He uses this word anachronism. So that means ideological error or an ideological mistake means to think the actuality with a concept from the past. For example, for him, idealism maybe it was correct in the 1900s because idealism was progressive and kind of thinking along the historical movement in the same direction than the historical movement of the time. However, in Japan in the 1930s, Tosaka will say idealism now is an anachronism. So Kyoto School is kind of anachronistic because they are thinking not in the same direction that historical time, but they are thinking backwards, right? But this is interesting. So Tosaka temporalizes the concept of ideology through this idea of anachronism. So, and he observes that fascism or traditionalism, right, all these conservative movements that we find in Japan during this time, they are kind of, they want to go back to the past, or they refer to the past, or like this Japaneseness or this Japanese spirit, or even Watsuji, right? Tosaka is, as you said, very critical of Watsuji. He finds in Watsuji this kind of obsession for etymologies, Japanese etymologies. And for Watsuji, right, in the word ningen, you have somehow the core of the interpretation of the Japanese identity or something like that, right? Tosaka hates that. There you see how he uses the concept of ideology to criticize that.
Most recently, as you stated, Tosaka Jun's The Japanese Ideology, a Marxist Critique of Liberalism and Fascism, has been translated into English. So how important is this text in relation to Jun's philosophical work? And perhaps you could outline some of its main concepts.
It's a very important book. For sure, it's great, and it's a monumental task because translating Tosaka is not really easy, I will say. At least for me, it's much more easier to read Miki in Japanese than to read Tosaka. He has a very convoluted way of writing. Anyway, yeah, it's a monumental task, but I'm grateful that someone else did that for us, right? Yeah, so in the Japanese ideology, I will say, as I said, it's kind of the third book where Tosaka talks about ideology. If we want to find a definition of ideology, we will not find it in the Japanese ideology, but maybe more we could reconstruct it in these previous books where he talks about anachronism and so on. But yeah, the Japanese ideology is a book where he more, maybe we can say he applies um, what he developed previously. He applies this concept of ideology and anachronism into the Japanese reality, as you said. Um, and he analyzes different dimensions uh, of this Japanese mentality or the Japanese cultural world, and how then this ideology operates in these different fields, right? So he talks about liberalism, for example, and as I said, like how liberalism and cultural liberalism actually serves the interests of um, capitalism and fascism. He talks about how the notion of family operates in the Japanese society. Forms of philosophy at the end tend to be anachronistic, right? He uses expressions such as philologism. That will be what Suji maybe, right? Philologism, this obsession for etymologies. Literatourism is the way Stolz translates these other terms. So this is very, for Tosaka is very skeptic of this, or let's say sacralization of language in a way, right? Uh, Tosaka in that sense is, I mean, as a Marxist also is an internationalist. So he's against the idea that you cannot translate texts. So for him, texts are able to be translated. So really, you will find a lot of different topics in that book. I'm particularly interested in, for example, if we are thinking in the concept of anachronism that I mentioned before, Tosaka says very interesting things about the way we understand progress and the way we understand reaction. So again, for he has this aspect of temporality is super important for Tosaka, and you will find it again in the Japanese ideology. Um, he talks about the bourgeois concept of progress, almost an idealistic concept of progress, and he compares this concept of progress with the idea of a magnet, right? So for the idealist notion of history, you have some kind of external telos, a goal, which attracts history from the outside, like a magnet, right? And you move towards that goal. Maybe we can think about Hegel, where you have something outside history that somehow determines history. And in opposition to this, Tosaka has another image, which is the image of a wheel. And he says, materialism, materialist, the materialist idea of history is more similar to the wheel. In this image of the wheel, there is no goal, right? What you have is the movement of history, and Tosaka says the pressure, someone pushing the wheel, and Tosaka says the pressure of the masses pushing the wheel, and then but then you have the problem of Marxism to a certain extent is how to answer the question of determinism, right? If you don't have a telos, and you have just like a kind of causal understanding of history, you have causes and effects. you could end having you have the risk of ending up with determinism, right? So kind of historical determinism that many people accuse Marxism of that kind of determinism. But Tosaka's image is very interesting because he says in this image of the wheel, what we have is um, there is always a part of the wheel touching the floor, right? That touching the earth, touching the soil or the road. And Tosaka says whether some idea is incorporated into history depends of uh, that moment in which the part of the wheel touches the earth or the road. So there is a kind of idea of contingency in Tosaka. So ideas should be ready, and there will be a chance for these ideas to become part of history. Um, so yeah, so I will think Japanese ideology not just as a text about concrete analysis of cultural phenomena, which of course it is, but you will find also Tosaka's theoretical framework in that book. For that reason, it's a very important book, I will say, and it's a very good way to get into Tosaka, I think.
I think that's good for the viewers too, because this has been translated into English, and it's a good way of getting into his
Yeah,
philosophy or his political thought as well. One last question. It's kind of I was thinking in our previous episode on Mickey, we had talked about Mickey's kind of activism. Mickey was also in jail, but then there was also, Mickey also defended certain sense
yeah,
what about June's activism? Because I see, mirroring June and Marx. Marx was also uh, he was also a journalist for a while, wrote in several newspapers, several journals. So how do you see June's activism?
yeah. On the one hand, I was okay. One of the main um, aspects of June's uh, activism, I will say, is this his involvement in this materialism studies group. Because, as I said, he was not just writing for the journal they had, but he was editing the journal, and they also had like a series of books about different topics, and they were very active. So in a certain way, Tosaka put a lot of energy into that project. Um, it lasts just a couple of years between 1932 and 1938 when they have to disappear, so to say. But this group is quite important. Quite important also kind of understanding what's happening in the time. So they in the pages of their journal, you will find that they talk about the Kyoto School, that they talk about technology, that they talk about science. So they are really kind of trying to respond to the urgencies of the time. Tosaka is someone, maybe his activism is also closely related to, actually, he was, as I said before, he was skeptic about the sacralization of language. But at the same time, he was someone who really put value in words. And he's someone who never changes his terminology, at least so clearly. Mickey, after detention in 1930, somehow he stops using materialist like Marxist terminology. He doesn't talk about class or social classes anymore, and so on, or proletariat. But Tosaka, um, he was constantly being censored, but I don't see really a change in the way he uses language, and that's one of the reasons why he ends up again always having problems with the police. Um, so his activism is very clearly linked to the use of the word and being able to keep writing about the topics he considers relevant, especially his criticism to the academia, right? He's very critical of the academia, um, and the special position that academia has within knowledge production. That's why being a journalist or being part of journalism is also a way to produce knowledge. It's in the everydayness where knowledge is produced. He's not really involved in like uh, activism in a more political sense, but he's an activist uh, of the world, and this is something that troubles him all the time because he writes a lot about the intellectuals and what's the role of intellectuals and so on. So giving voice to these problems of the everyday life, so to say, I think is one of his core concerns, main concerns.
And how is Jun now recognized in Japan and in academia?
Yeah, I would say he's not super discussed, even yeah, even nowadays. Also in comparison with Miki, and he's recognized as a kind of martyr to a certain extent. Um, some years ago, there was even like a play about his life, the theater, right? But besides those kind of more sporadic episodes, I would say there is not as really a systematic interest in Tosaka. However, right, I think it's not a coincidence that this book is translated now. I mean, also Stolz says that in the preface and in the preface of the book. Is somehow to think fascism, Tosaka becomes very relevant. Not just because he points out this relation between liberalism and fascism, and technology and fascism, but also because the way he does it shows us how fascism also operates on micro levels, micro political levels, and macro political levels at the same time. And the question of translation, right? What is fascism? What can we call fascism? Is this fascism? Can we use the same word to describe our current time? Um, so yeah, this is a question that Tosaka helps us to formulate that at least.
So I want to thank you so much for taking the time to navigate us through this, turbulent life and really rich, complex philosophical thought and political thought of June.
No, thank you for giving me the opportunity. I hope was somehow understandable. But yeah, viewers should check out the book for sure.